Hello, everyone. It's that time again to talk about Latin American and Caribbean studies. I got a weird little thing over my head there. I'm trying to move it, but it doesn't want to move. So I'll just leave it alone. So today, this is Joseph Holbrook, your sincere and devoted professor. Let me turn this sound the rest of the way down. There we go. And today we're dealing with chapter 1 in Swanson's book, Introduction, Companion to Latin American and Caribbean Studies. And today we're going to be talking about geography. And this is a little bit different than what you might expect, because it's not going to be talking in terms of dry numbers and square miles and flora and fauna. It's going to be talking more about the imagined geography from a postmodern point of view. So let us begin. I'm using Prezi today. Let's see how it works on this. So one of the things that we want you to think about in this course is, where is Latin America? Where is Latin America? Where exactly is it? Is it in Spanish-speaking countries? Is it in the United States? Does it include Brazil? If Latin is used in order to broaden Spanish America to include French America, what about Quebec? Traditionally, Haiti is considered part of Latin America, but Quebec is not. Why not? Belize, on the coast of Central America, and other English-speaking islands in the West Indies have not traditionally been considered part of Latin America. Therefore, in our program and in this course, we say Introduction to Latin America and the Caribbean, and as an attempt to include English-speaking, the English-speaking Caribbean. And so I want to mess with your minds a little bit with this different point of view. We're going to talk for a few minutes about maps, and this is an upside-down map. So it has Canada at the bottom and Argentina and Chile at the top, and that's in order to kind of challenge our thinking a little bit. So maps are subjective and socially constructed according to the author. This might be a surprise for some of you. This may be the first time you've heard this. You may think that maps are simply a matter of drawing boundaries, rivers, and mountains, and that it's a very empirical process. But actually, the whole history of map making shows that maps are more about culture and about the imagination than they are the empirical location of things. The dominant representation of world maps in the medieval period, for example, was a cruciform shape. I'll show you that in a minute. So it was shaped in the form of a cross, with one part being composed of Asia, another part was Europe, and a third part was Africa. Why 3 in the medieval period? Well, if you know the story in the Bible of Noah and the flood, how many sons did he escape the destruction of the world with? And according to the biblical narrative, it was 3. Does anyone know the names of those 3 sons? They were Japheth, Shem, and Ham. And so in the medieval period, people conceived of the world as 3 continents inhabited by the descendants of the 3 sons of Noah. So there's where we bring in culture and imagination. Let me show you this. So here's the cruciform map. You see Asia's at the top, and underneath Asia you have the name Sem or Shem, from which we get our word Semite. Anti-Semitism comes from the name of Noah's son Shem. And of course, the Hebrew people and Arabic people are considered to be Semitic, descended from Shem in a sense, if you take the story literally. Over on the left, we see Europa, which was the Latin or the Spanish pronunciation of Europe. Europa ending in A. So you have Asia, Europa, and Africa, all ending in A, all feminine. In Europa, we have the name Japheth, which was another one of Noah's sons. And under Africa, we have Ham, a medieval spelling of Ham. And so we have Shem, Japheth, and Ham in 3 continents in the world. And some maps would turn this on its side. If you turn it on its side, you can see how it roughly corresponds to the actual locations of Asia, Europe, and Africa, with Asia being to the east, Europe being northwest, and Africa being to the south or southwest. Also notice that there's a dot in the middle. It's a little bit blurred, but that says Jerusalem. So part of this medieval imaginary was that it was influenced by Christianity with the cross shape, or the cruciform shape, and at the center of the cross is Jerusalem, the center of the whole world. And so you can see that these maps have almost nothing to do with empirical boundaries or GPS settings. This map is almost entirely formed by a social imaginary, a social imagination that is formed by a medieval biblical understanding. Here's a map of the world after Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492. So can you imagine the shock of these early explorers, Christians, conquistadores, when they discovered a 4th continent? Yes, I said a 4th continent. So we have 3 continents: Europa, Asia, Africa, with the inhabitants descended from the 3 children of Noah. And suddenly Christopher Columbus and his navigators and sailors discover a new continent, although they weren't initially aware that it was a new continent. They thought it was the outlying islands around Japan on their way to India. And so the American hemisphere, or the new hemisphere, the Western Hemisphere, was considered to be one continent when it was named by Amerigo Vespucci, an Italian navigator who was navigating on a ship southward along the coast of Brazil. I believe it was 1500 or 1501. I'm not mistaken. In history, it's not so important to know the exact date as it is to know the significance of events. Amerigo Vespucci was sailing along the coast of Brazil towards the south, and he noticed that the constellations were different than any that he was familiar with. He had crossed the equator. And he also realized that this coastline that he was following was too big to be an island. Therefore, it had to be a continent. And he therefore named it in honor of himself, Amerigo, but he Latinized it and then he feminized it and made it America, so that it rhymed with Africa, Asia, and Europa. This was one continent, the American continent. This is why we have North America, South America, and Central America, because they're 3 different parts of one continent. So at this point now we have 4 continents in the social or cultural imaginary. And Jerusalem had been conceived as the center, but now they have a new problem, because who were these people living on the 4th continent, the American continent? Who were these people that were already there? Were they unknown children or descendants of Noah? Were they lost tribes of Israel? This was the problem that medieval explorers were trying to figure out. In I have the wrong date on there. I'm sorry. I will fix that later. But the Mercator map was made in 1569, not 1869. It was developed in 1569, and I'll show you a picture of it. But the problem with it is it diminishes the southern portion of the hemisphere. Notice Greenland and compare it to the size of Africa. This is the Mercator map, and many people would argue that it's politically very biased towards a Northern European point of view, because anytime you take a map off of a globe and stretch it out into a flat two-dimensional surface, you're going to have some kind of distortion. And that's the case here. And so several years later, we go along and we come up with the Gall-Peters map. And I'll show that to you. This is the Gall-Peters map. And this is a little bit more accurate. It shows the relative sizes of the continents much more accurately. You notice that South America looks much bigger in relation to North America. You notice that Africa looks much bigger than the little tip of Greenland that you can see. This is the Gall-Peters map. The problem is that the contours and outlines of some of the larger nations are not as accurate. And so this was the Mercator map, and it shows Africa as tiny compared to Greenland. And then over here you have the Gall-Peters map, which is more accurate in terms of relative size. And I don't have in my notes the name of this map. It begins with A, and I can't remember what it's called, but this is now the primary map being used in Japan in schools to teach children. You see this white area down here? This is Antarctica. And here you have South America. Brazil is much more pronounced in this map, and the United States. And you see that South America looks much larger in comparison with North America. And over here you have, this is the North Pole. This is the South, and this is the North. So it's stretching out the entire globe. Rather than north to south, this would be west going up and east going down. And this is a much more accurate map. Let me show you one other thing here. I spent some time in Rio de Janeiro, roughly right about here, a few years ago, learning Portuguese. And we all know, those of us that live in Miami, that Miami is sometimes referred to as the capital of Latin America. Another way of looking at it is Latin America is here, North America is here, and Miami is sort of a bridge, north and south. But in this map, you can see pretty clearly that Miami is also a bridge, east and west. When I was living in Rio de Janeiro for a summer, I was 3 time zones ahead of my family in Miami. But if you call to California from Miami, it's another 3 time zones. So there's 6 time zones east along this east-west axis here. So you see how maps are influenced by imagination. The author of this chapter says that Latin America has become deterritorialized and displaced. And it takes a little bit of thinking and reading of this part of the chapter to get your mind around what he's trying to say. But he's basically referring to the process of globalization, global free markets, and he invents some new words: ethnoscapes, technoscapes, idioscapes, financescapes. And so I have definitions here. You can read them in the chapter. The ethnoscape describes the persons who constitute the world in which we live: tourists, refugees, guest workers, and students. The author lives in London, and he described places as he would go across London on a bus, where he would run into various nationals and various expats from various countries in Latin America or the Caribbean, in a variety of locations across London. That's an ethnoscape. We have that here in Miami. If you go far enough south, you'll find a lot of really good Mexican restaurants. You'll meet people who are agricultural workers, perhaps from Haiti, perhaps from Mexico. Some of the people from Mexico speak indigenous languages better than they do Spanish, perhaps. A few years ago, I know they were advertising in Homestead looking for someone who could speak Mixtec and help translate for social service purposes. And Technoscapes, Technoscapes is the geography of technology. And so this is talking about how Latin America is encountered by people who live in Ohio, people who live in London, people who live in Russia. People in Moscow are taking salsa lessons. A lot of Latin American dances are very popular in Paris, London. So this is somewhat of what it's talking about is through Twitter, through YouTube, through social media. Latin America and the Caribbean can be encountered in many parts of the world. So Latin America is no longer in Latin America. It's spread out. That's what it means at the top about becoming deterritorialized. Latin American films, Shakira, music. It's no longer limited to whatever Latin America is, and we still need to talk about that. Where exactly is Latin America? Financescape is talking about financial institutions, emerging stock markets, emerging industries in Latin America. So let's move on. 20th century travel accounts and 19th. So one of the things it's talking about here is the picture of Latin America that we can develop by reading travel accounts. Travel writers give preferences to places and meanings. And what that means is if you're traveling and you are writing down what you see in the place you're traveling, you're going to pick some things based on your personal interests and ignore some other things. I'll give you a great example. I was a Spanish language major at Ohio State University, and I went to Colombia for a 2-week trip, and I took dozens, if not hundreds, of pictures. And I had friends at the university, Ohio State University, that were graduate students from Colombia. So I invited them over to my house. I fixed a meal, and I sat down to show on one of these old-fashioned slideshows. This was back in the late 1980s. I started showing my pictures of Colombia to my family and to my friends from the university. And I found it fascinating, but my friends from the university, who were all pretty much upper-class elite people from the upper-class and elite strata of Colombia, that's how they could afford to be in Ohio studying for a PhD. As I went through the pictures, I noticed they were getting more and more agitated. And the reason was I took pictures of those things that seemed unusual, odd, exotic to me. And that was mostly the poverty, the ramshackle shacks, people living beside streams, somebody bathing in a stream. It was a very negative picture of Colombia. And that's what I gave preference to because it was my first time there, and I had this image of Colombia as a very poor banana republic, and I took pictures to confirm my own prejudice. And so one of the students confronted me about my choice of pictures and said, there's a lot of beauty in Colombia. Why didn't you take pictures of the beauty and the culture? And she was absolutely right. One person said, in a quote, good taste and chic in Great Britain may depend on the consumption of an image of Latin America as exotic. And this begins a discussion of bananas and coffee. Latin America produces a lot of luxury commodities such as bananas, coffee, sugar, rum, tobacco. Many of these people who traveled in writing these imaginative geographies or these travel accounts were imperial citizens. In other words, they were British, or they were from what we would call in world systems theory, they were from core countries, highly industrialized or advanced countries, traveling in the peripheral countries where industrialization had not advanced as much. The perfect example, according to the author, is from the 19th century, and is Charles Darwin's The Voyage of the Beagle. In these travel accounts, there's a tone of objectivity that gives authority to the narrative. The natives are viewed as scientific objects to be studied. I had a map of the Voyage of the Beagle's journey around the world, and I forgot to upload it here. I guess I'll get it next time, or you can Google it. So, representations of Latin America. These travel accounts commonly have a sense of detachment, and there's a implied domination over the landscape. In the travel accounts, Latin American nature is presented as overpowering, abundantly fertile, sort of a Garden of Eden, flourishing of plant life and jungle and huge, humongous flowers. Alexander von Humboldt was another traveler, a scientific traveler from Prussia. He wrote a 30-volume account of his travels called A Personal Narrative of Travels to the equinoctial regions of the Americas in 1814 to 1826. So he was a little bit before Darwin. And he also discussed the lush landscape of Latin America and contrasted it with the poverty of the human poverty of the inhabitants. In his account, nature dominated over the inhabitants. And the inhabitants, the people, were considered indolent, lazy, perhaps because of the heat. Those are some of the theories in the 19th century. And in Alexander von Humboldt's view, and the view of many other of these European travelers, Latin America was incapable of development without assistance or help from the more advanced countries, which was a very paternalistic attitude. Representations of Latin America as British culture. Many of the travelers, such as Darwin, were British. Even in London, Latin America was on display all over London, in the museums, in the London Zoo, even in Harrods. For example, the Victoria and Albert Museums had displays from Latin America, the Natural History Museum and the British Museum. The Botanical Gardens had displays from Latin America. In these displays, the human scale is dwarfed by the overpowering nature, enormous flowers. This is a common theme of the outsider's gaze at Latin America, was that they were in awe of the nature, but not too impressed with the people. Representations of Latin America as a coffee cup. A common concept from Karl Marx that is often used in analyzing economics and culture is commodity fetishism, where a particular commodity is fetishized or it becomes a status symbol. Aldous Huxley visited a coffee estate in Guatemala in the 1930s, and he made the observation that these cups of coffee cheer, but they do not inebriate. But they required, in order to cultivate the coffee and harvest it, it required the use of children to pay such sweated, colored labor that if they paid them European wages, it would raise the cost to the consumer by 8 or 10 times for a cup of coffee. Well, I don't know about Starbucks, but it seems like it's gotten a bit expensive to me. So what he was observing was that many of the coffee growers were small families with a small plot of land, and the only way they could make a profitable living growing and cultivating coffee was to have a large family and have their children involved as free labor in the process of cultivating and harvesting coffee. That's what he's referring to there, and that if everyone got paid according to European wages, it would make the cost of coffee prohibitive. Studies have shown that only about 40% of coffee profits make it back to the home country that's exporting, and only 10% of the coffee profits make it back to the farmer who actually raised the coffee. That looks good. I gotta have my coffee in the morning. There's Juan Valdez. This is an image of Café de Colombia. I believe there's a few Juan Valdez coffee shops in Miami now. So we're coming down the backstretch here. Another thing that the author talks about is the image of the exotic. So he's speaking from the point of view of a British culture. If you're fashionable in Great Britain, part of your fashion might be the exotic, what he calls the exotic. So you see this figure on the right here, sort of an Indiana Jones look with the safari hat and the shirt. That's actually a picture I got off the internet from the Safari Clothing Company, one of the companies he mentions. On the left, those are pictures I got off of a website for the Banana Republic. So these commercial companies market an image of the exotic. And if you want to be cool in Great Britain, I'm speaking for Great Britain because that's the author of the chapter we're reading is from there. If you want to be cool in Great Britain, then you purchase items that carry with them this atmosphere, this image of exoticism from Latin America or Africa. He goes on to say that Starbucks tries to create the belief that one is not buying coffee from a faceless multinational, but from a locally in touch retailer. He's referring there to some of their literature that he picked up and was reading in a Starbucks in London, which gives sort of a biography of where the coffee was created and how it was created and by who and how it got to Starbucks. So in conclusion, this chapter, the author tries to show through the concept of imaginative geographies how Latin America is both a real site and it's also a visual site, a representation of a place that is displaced beyond physical space through discourses and images. We can expect that with globalization, Latin America will appear an ever greater part of everyone's landscape and material culture. But in so doing, the geographical imagination may also place Latin America as further away, as different or more exotic. Latin America has been represented as a space of disease, laziness, immorality, violence, compared to which Europe is perceived as superior. I don't want to get political, but if you remember the comments that kicked off a firestorm in our political process in 2016 about immigration across the southern border, there was a mention of sickness, disease, drugs, rape. Not that does not exist. And I'm not making a political comment here. I'm just saying that it's very common perception, going back 2 centuries, of Latin America in this fashion. An episode, when the author was writing the chapter in this book, he mentions that there was an episode of The Simpsons that came out that was set in Rio de Janeiro. I have not seen it. Some of you maybe have seen it. But it depicted men in Rio de Janeiro as bisexuals. It depicted a samba school teaching a fictitious dance called La Penetrada. I'm sure you know what that means. And it also showed Copacabana Beach being roamed by vicious monkeys and tourists being kidnapped by taxi drivers and mugged by street children. So this is an image that's still with us, even in The Simpsons. And like every stereotype, there's always examples where things do happen, but a stereotype takes it to an extreme. The poorly educated favela, which is the Portuguese word for slum or shanty town, the poorly educated youth of Rio de Janeiro consciously appropriate and manipulate Western commodities as a sign of distinction. I wonder whether the cultural class in Britain, says the author, can deconstruct the meanings of their cappuccino with equal skill. I'll just stop there. I can think of lots of examples of this issue of identities and images, but I do want to say that I was looking on the website for the relative sizes and populations of the United States and Canada versus Latin America. What I found was North America versus South America, and North America has quite a bit larger square miles than South America, and has about 100 million more people in population. But remember, that's North America. So when I recalculated the numbers, adding Mexico onto South America as part of Latin America, and I added in Central America and the Caribbean into Latin America, if you compare Latin America with Anglo-America, let us say, in the United States and Canada, the population's about the same, and Latin America is a little bit bigger. So we'll stop here. Please let me know if you have any questions. Come and see me. I get lonely in my office. I hope you do well this week. Thank you.